For years, Windows has been the default choice sitting on almost every laptop you could buy from a big box store. But something has been quietly shifting inside some of the largest computer makers on the planet, and very few people outside the tech industry have been paying close attention to it. Dell and HP, two of the biggest PC manufacturers in the world, have both been expanding their support for Linux in ways that go far beyond a small side project. This is not a rumor. This is not clickbait. This is something you can verify yourself by walking straight onto their official websites right now. In this video, we are going to break down exactly what is happening, why it matters, and what it tells us about where computing might be heading in the next few years. Let's start with the basics, so everyone watching is on the same page. Linux is a free and open source operating system that anyone can install, modify, and distribute. Unlike Windows, which is owned and tightly controlled by Microsoft, Linux exists as a kind of shared foundation that thousands of developers around the world contribute to. Because it is open source, companies can build their own versions of it, called distributions, tailored to whatever purpose they need. Ubuntu, Fedora, Debian, Pop! OS, these are all different flavors of Linux built on the same underlying kernel. For a long time, Linux had a reputation as something only programmers and hardcore hobbyists used. That reputation is quickly becoming outdated. Let's look at the actual numbers, because numbers do not lie the way headlines sometimes do. Back in July of 2022, Linux held roughly 2.76% of the global desktop operating system market. That might sound tiny, and in the grand scheme of things, it was. Windows completely dominated the space with somewhere around 70 to 80% of all desktop computers running it. But something started to change after that point. By 2024, Linux had crossed the 4% threshold for the first time in its history, hitting an all-time high of around 4.44% in the middle of that year. Then, in 2025, the growth accelerated even further. Linux desktop market share reached about 4.7% globally, which represented roughly a 70% increase compared to just 3 years earlier. In June of 2025, something historic happened. The United States crossed the 5% threshold for Linux desktop usage for the very first time in its history. That might not sound like a huge number if you are used to seeing Windows dominate every chart, but consider the pace of that growth. It took Linux almost 2 full decades to reach just 1% market share back in 2011. It took another entire decade to reach 2% in 2021. But the jump from 2% to 3% only took about 2 years. And the jump from 3% to 4% took less than a year. That kind of accelerating curve is not random noise sitting inside messy data. That is an operating system whose adoption pattern is bending upward faster than it ever has before. So why is this happening now, after decades of Linux being stuck in single-digit territory? There are several very real, very identifiable reasons, and none of them involve secret conspiracies or panicking billionaires. The first and probably biggest reason is Windows 10 reaching its end of support date in October of 2025. Millions of computers around the world were running Windows 10, and when Microsoft stopped providing regular security updates for that version, users faced a choice. They could upgrade to Windows 11, they could buy an entirely new computer, or they could switch to something else. Here is the problem for a lot of people. Windows 11 has strict hardware requirements, including something called TPM 2.0, a security chip that many older computers simply do not have. That means millions of perfectly functional laptops and desktops, machines that still work great for browsing, writing documents, and everyday tasks, are technically not eligible to run Windows 11. For many of these users, buying a brand new computer just to keep using Windows felt wasteful and unnecessary. Installing a free, modern, actively supported version of Linux on their existing hardware suddenly became a very attractive alternative. This single event, the end of Windows 10 support colliding with Windows 11's hardware restrictions, has been one of the single biggest drivers of Linux adoption in recent memory. The second major driver is gaming, and this one genuinely surprises a lot of people. For years, Linux was considered basically unusable for gaming because most major game studios only built their games for Windows. That started to shift dramatically with the release of the Steam Deck, a handheld gaming device built by Valve that runs on Steam OS, which is itself a Linux-based operating system. The Steam Deck proved something that a lot of people doubted was possible. It proved that, with the right compatibility layer, specifically a tool called Proton that translates Windows game code so it can run on Linux, the vast majority of popular games actually run just fine on a Linux system. This opened the floodgates. Suddenly, gamers who had never considered Linux before were experiencing it firsthand through their Steam Deck, and many of them liked what they saw enough to install a Linux distribution on their main desktop or laptop as well. According to Steam's own hardware survey, Linux usage among PC gamers on the platform has been sitting somewhere in the range of 2 to 3%, which again might sound small, but represents millions of actual gamers, a group that historically had almost zero meaningful representation on Linux at all, Valve has continued pushing this trend forward. And every new device or update in that ecosystem chips away a little more at the old assumption that Linux and gaming simply do not mix. Now here is a fact that surprises a lot of people the first time they hear it. The vast majority of the internet does not run on Windows. It runs on Linux. When you check your email, watch a video, scroll through social media, or shop online, the servers processing those requests are overwhelmingly running some flavor of Linux. Linux powers somewhere around 45% of all server operating systems worldwide, and that number climbs even higher when you look specifically at cloud computing infrastructure. Nearly 60% of all websites with an identifiable server operating system run on Linux. Every single one of the world's fastest supercomputers, according to the official rankings that track this kind of thing, runs on Linux, representing 100% of that list. Within the enterprise server world specifically, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, a commercial distribution backed by IBM, holds a commanding position with over 40% market share among managed enterprise environments, valued by large companies for its long-term support contracts and enterprise-grade reliability. Ubuntu, meanwhile, leads the pack among Linux distributions running on public-facing web servers. And it also shows up as the single most popular choice among software developers who prefer working in a Linux environment day to day. Every single one of the top public cloud providers, including Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud, relies heavily on Linux to run its infrastructure. Yes, even Microsoft's own cloud platform runs a huge percentage of its virtual machines on Linux rather than Windows, which is a remarkable shift for a company that once treated Linux as a direct threat to its entire business model. And then there's the elephant in the room that almost nobody thinks about when this topic comes up, which is Android. Android, the operating system running on the overwhelming majority of smartphones on the planet, billions upon billions of devices, is built directly on top of the Linux kernel. It might not look like the Linux you would install on a laptop, since Google built an entirely different interface and application ecosystem on top of it, but underneath the surface, the fundamental core of the operating system is Linux. When you account for smartphones running Android, Linux is arguably already the single most widely used operating system kernel on the entire planet, dwarfing Windows by a massive margin once you count total devices, rather than just traditional desktop and laptop computers. This matters enormously for companies like Dell and HP, because their business is not just about selling laptops to your average shopper. A massive portion of their revenue comes from enterprise clients, data centers, government contracts, and developers who build the software that runs on all of that server and cloud infrastructure. If a software engineer is going to spend their entire career writing code that will eventually run on Linux servers, it makes a lot of sense for that engineer to want a laptop that runs Linux natively too, rather than fighting with compatibility layers or dual boot setups just to match their development environment to their production environment. Dell has actually been selling Linux-powered laptops for more than a decade, through what it calls the Developer Edition line. The most well-known example is the Dell XPS Developer Edition, which ships directly from the factory with Ubuntu pre-installed instead of Windows. This program traces back to an internal Dell initiative once known as Project Sputnik, where Dell engineers worked directly with the Ubuntu development team to make sure Ubuntu ran flawlessly on Dell's premium XPS hardware, with proper support for things like touchpads, high-resolution displays, and power management, all the small details that often make or break the Linux experience on a given laptop. This is not some obscure hidden option buried 3 menus deep in a settings page. It is a fully supported product line that Dell markets specifically to software engineers, data scientists, and anyone who prefers working in a Linux environment. Beyond the consumer-facing XPS line, Dell also certifies many of its precision workstations to run Ubuntu and Red Hat Enterprise Linux, machines that are used heavily in fields like engineering, scientific computing, film production, and machine learning research. HP has been moving in a similar direction, and its commitment to Linux support has been visible for years across its business and workstation product lines. HP's Z-series workstations, aimed at professionals doing heavy computational work in fields like architecture, engineering, and content creation, offer certified compatibility with distributions like Red Hat Enterprise Linux and Ubuntu. Having official Linux certification on these machines means businesses can deploy them at scale with full vendor support, rather than relying on unofficial community fixes and workarounds. HP has also worked to ensure solid driver support for Linux across a range of its other business laptops, recognizing that a meaningful slice of its enterprise and developer customer base either prefers or specifically requires Linux compatibility for their work. So why would 2 of the largest PC manufacturers in the world spend real time and resources supporting an operating system that most casual consumers have never even heard of by name? The answer comes down to where the real growth and real technical demand is happening across the industry. And it has less to do with the laptop sitting on the average person's desk, and more to do with what is happening behind the scenes in servers, cloud computing, and enterprise software development. Supporting Linux on their consumer and prosumer hardware is Dell and HP's way of staying relevant to an incredibly important and steadily growing customer segment, one that skews toward the exact kind of technically sophisticated, high-value customers that hardware companies do not want to lose to smaller specialist competitors. There's also a security and cost angle that businesses care deeply about. Linux has a long-standing reputation for being more resistant to the kinds of wide-scale malware and ransomware campaigns that frequently target Windows systems, partly because of its permission structure and partly because it simply has not historically been as large a target given its smaller share of the desktop market. For large organizations managing thousands of machines, even a small reduction in vulnerability translates into real savings and reduced operational risk. On top of that, Linux itself is free to license, which can significantly cut costs for large-scale deployments compared to paying for Windows licenses across an entire fleet of machines, a factor that becomes enormous once you scale it up to tens or hundreds of thousands of computers. This cost and control angle is exactly why governments around the world have become one of the most important forces behind Linux adoption in recent years. And this part of the story rarely makes headlines, even though it might be the most consequential piece of it. In Germany, the state of Schleswig-Holstein became the first European region to completely replace Microsoft software with Linux and LibreOffice across its public offices, a transition finalized in April of 2024, involving tens of thousands of government employees switching their entire daily workflow away from Windows and Microsoft Office. In France, the National Gendarmerie, a branch of the French military responsible for law enforcement, has been running a custom Ubuntu-based Linux distribution called Gendbuntu across more than 103,000 computers, meaning well over 100,000 machines used by French law enforcement personnel run on Linux rather than Windows. Denmark's Ministry of Digital Affairs announced its own transition away from Microsoft and toward open source platforms, planned across the second half of 2025. Switzerland has gone even further, committing more than $230 million to build a national cloud service and passing legislation that actually mandates government-developed software be released as open source by law. And at the broader European Union level, there have been serious ongoing discussions about developing what is sometimes informally referred to as an EU Linux operating system, a unified open source platform that could eventually be deployed across public administrations in every member state, reducing the bloc's dependence on any single foreign software vendor. When a government relies entirely on software owned by a single foreign company, it creates a dependency that a growing number of officials have become uncomfortable with, especially as geopolitical tensions around technology, data privacy, and digital sovereignty have increased in recent years. Open source software offers an alternative where the underlying code can be inspected, audited, and modified without needing permission from any single corporation, which matters enormously for institutions handling sensitive citizen data. Windows itself has also been giving people more reasons to look elsewhere, beyond just the Windows 11 hardware requirements we already covered. Over the past several years, Windows has increasingly integrated advertisements into its start menu and settings pages, bundled in additional software many users never asked for, and expanded telemetry data collection that tracks how people use their computers. For a growing number of users, these changes have felt less like helpful improvements and more like a company optimizing its operating system for its own advertising and data interests, rather than for the people actually using the computer every day. Linux, by contrast, offers a clean, ad-free, and highly customizable experience where the user retains much more control over what runs on their machine and what data leaves it. None of this means that Windows is somehow disappearing or that Dell and HP are secretly abandoning their most profitable product lines, and it is worth being very clear about that. Windows still commands somewhere around 70% of the global desktop market, and that dominance is not going to change overnight. Most of that Windows dominance comes from corporate and enterprise environments where employees generally do not get to choose their own operating system, and where massive existing investments in Windows-specific software, internal tools, and IT infrastructure make switching an enormous undertaking most businesses are simply not going to pursue quickly, if ever. There are also real practical obstacles still holding back further Linux desktop growth. Certain popular multiplayer games rely on anti-cheat systems that either do not work on Linux at all or only work with significant workarounds, keeping a large segment of the gaming population tied to Windows, regardless of how good Proton and other compatibility tools have become. Certain specialized professional software, particularly in fields like video editing, music production, and creative design, either does not exist for Linux at all or exists in a more limited form compared to its Windows or Mac OS counterparts. And there remains a real learning curve for everyday users who have spent their entire lives using Windows and are not necessarily eager to learn a new system, even a free one, especially when their current setup already works fine for their needs. What is actually happening is more nuanced and, frankly, more interesting than any panic-driven headline could ever capture. Companies like Dell and HP are recognizing that the computing world is not one single monolithic market anymore. Developers want Linux. Enterprises running massive server farms want Linux. Governments concerned about cost and digital sovereignty want Linux. Gamers increasingly have access to Linux thanks to tools like Proton. Meanwhile, everyday consumers who just want to browse the web, check email, and use familiar software will likely keep buying Windows machines for a long time to come. Rather than betting everything on one operating system, these hardware companies are simply making sure they have strong offerings across every segment of the market, so they do not lose customers to competitors who do. It is also worth understanding why this broader shift has taken so long to become visible to the average person. Linux adoption on the desktop has historically been held back by a few very real challenges. Software compatibility has been a major one, since many popular applications, especially specialized professional tools and certain games, were built exclusively for Windows or Mac OS. Driver support for certain hardware components, especially newer graphics cards and specialized peripherals, has sometimes lagged behind on Linux compared to Windows. And for casual users accustomed to a certain workflow, switching operating systems can feel intimidating, even if the underlying technology has improved dramatically. These challenges have been shrinking steadily over the past several years as more companies, including major players like Dell, HP, Valve, and even Microsoft, with tools like its own Windows subsystem for Linux, have invested heavily in improving cross-compatibility. Speaking of Microsoft, it is genuinely fascinating how much the company's own relationship with Linux has changed over the past 2 decades. In the early 2000s, Microsoft's leadership publicly referred to Linux and open source software as threats to intellectual property, and even used harsh language comparing certain open source licensing models to a disease that spreads to everything it touches. Fast forward to today, and Microsoft is one of the largest corporate contributors to open source projects on platforms like GitHub, which it now owns outright. Microsoft Azure runs a majority of its cloud workloads on Linux virtual machines. Microsoft even built and maintains its own official Linux distribution called Azure Linux for use within its own cloud infrastructure. This complete reversal from open hostility to active, sustained investment says a lot about how undeniable the shift toward Linux in enterprise and cloud computing has become, even for the company that once saw it as an existential threat to its core business. For everyday consumers wondering whether any of this actually matters to them personally, the honest answer is that it depends entirely on what you use your computer for. If you are a casual user who just wants to browse social media, watch videos, and use standard Office software, Windows or Mac OS will likely remain the more familiar and convenient choice for the foreseeable future, and there is genuinely nothing wrong with that. But if you are a student learning to code, a developer building software, someone who values privacy and wants more control over your data, or simply someone curious about trying something different without spending extra money on a new operating system license, Linux has never been more accessible or more polished than it is right now. Modern Linux distributions like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Pop! OS, and Fedora offer clean, intuitive interfaces that are far more approachable to newcomers than the Linux of 10 or 15 years ago, with none of the intimidating command line barriers that used to scare beginners away almost immediately. Regionally, this growth has not been evenly distributed, and looking at where it is strongest tells its own story. India currently leads all major global economies in Linux desktop adoption, with figures reportedly around 16%, dramatically higher than the global average. Several factors explain this. Cost sensitivity plays a major role since many computer buyers and businesses in India are highly price conscious, and a free operating system has an obvious appeal in that kind of environment. Government digital literacy programs have also played a part, alongside the fact that India is home to one of the largest software developer communities in the world, a group of users who statistically gravitate toward Linux at far higher rates than the general population, because of the flexibility and control it offers for programming work. There is one more piece of this puzzle that often gets overlooked entirely, which is Chrome OS. Google's Chrome OS, the operating system running on Chromebooks used heavily in schools and budget-conscious households, is also built on a Linux foundation under the hood. While Chrome OS itself has a relatively modest share of the overall desktop market, it represents another major, mainstream operating system quietly relying on Linux as its technical backbone, alongside Android on the mobile side. When you line up Android, Chrome OS, traditional desktop Linux distributions, and the massive server and cloud infrastructure running the modern internet, a pattern starts to emerge. Linux is not really the underdog trying to break into the mainstream from the outside. In many of the places that matter most for how billions of people actually use technology every day, it has already become deeply embedded infrastructure, even if most users never consciously realize it. It is also worth talking briefly about why enterprise IT departments specifically have grown more comfortable with Linux over the past decade, since this trend feeds directly into what companies like Dell and HP choose to support with certified hardware. Large organizations value predictability and long-term support above almost everything else. And commercial Linux distributions like Red Hat Enterprise Linux and Ubuntu's own long-term support releases now offer exactly that. With support windows that can stretch for many years, professional technical support contracts, and rigorous security patching processes that rival, or in some cases exceed, what proprietary vendors offer. Combine that with the licensing cost savings at scale, the ability to customize the operating system for specific workloads, and the auditability that security-conscious industries like finance, healthcare, and government increasingly demand. And it becomes clear why enterprise Linux adoption has been climbing steadily rather than staying flat. This is the exact customer base that Dell and HP are targeting when they certify their workstation and server hardware for Linux compatibility. And it explains why this support has expanded gradually. None of this is really new information if you have been paying attention to enterprise technology news over the past several years, but it rarely gets packaged in a way that reaches everyday consumers, which is exactly why sensational headlines claiming secret panic or overnight obsolescence tend to spread faster than the more accurate, more measured version of the story. The accurate version is less dramatic on the surface, but arguably more impressive once you actually understand it. And the server's running most of the modern internet, without a single marketing campaign that could rival what companies like Microsoft or Apple spend every year. The broader lesson here is not that some dramatic overnight takeover has happened, because it has not. Dell and HP expanding their Linux offerings is not a sign of panic or secrecy. It is a rational business response to where their customers, especially their most technically sophisticated and highest value customers, are actually spending their time and money. The cloud runs on Linux. Supercomputers overwhelmingly run on Linux. Android, the most widely used mobile operating system on the planet, is itself built on the Linux kernel. Even Apple's macOS shares deep architectural roots with Unix, the operating system family that heavily influenced Linux's own development. When you step back and look at the full picture, Linux has not been some fringe underdog fighting for survival. In many of the most important corners of modern computing, it has quietly been a dominant force all along. And hardware makers like Dell and HP are simply making sure their product lines properly reflect that reality. So the next time you hear a dramatic headline claiming some secret corporate conspiracy is unfolding behind closed doors, or that a single company is suddenly in panic mode over an operating system, it is worth remembering that the real story is usually less about secrecy and more about companies responding openly and rationally to where technology and their customers are actually heading. Dell has been selling Linux laptops publicly for over a decade. HP has been expanding its Linux-certified workstation lineup in full view of anyone paying attention. Governments across Europe have been making these switches through public policy announcements, not backroom deals. If you found this breakdown interesting, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the real trends shaping the technology industry. Because understanding what is actually happening behind the headlines is far more valuable and honestly far more interesting than chasing the next sensational claim.